All right, welcome everyone to today's HLAA webinar, the Job Accommodation Network, JAN, your partner in employment. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Amanda Watson, and I'm the meeting planner for HLAA and your host today. Today's presentation is being recorded and will be available for playback at a later time on the HLA website, hearingloss.org. I will start by giving you a few tech tips. To see captions on this webinar, you will need to click on the CC icon and click on Show Subtitle. You can change the font size and you can increase the font size in subtitle settings. Chat is available for technical issues and panelists only. We would like participants to use the Q&A icon to ask questions. We will be using this to facilitate questions and answers after the presentation. If you've joined by computer, the presentation should be in side-by-side mode. Slides are on the left and panelists are on the right in gallery view. You can change the size of your side-by-side view by hovering between the two screens and moving the gray bar to your adjusted size. If you've joined by mobile device or phone, your view may be different and you may have to scroll between views to your desired view. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Kelly Tremblay. Dr. Tremblay is an audiologist. She's an HLA board member and a member of HLA's Employment Task Force. Kelly, I now turn it over to you.
Thank you, Amanda, and hi to everyone out there. We've got a great group today. We have over 200 people registered, so this is exciting. And because the recordings will be available online, we hope you'll share them with your friends and peers. So as Amanda said, I'm an audiologist, I'm a neuroscientist, and I'm a board member of HLAA. And today I'm here as the chair of the Employment Task Force. Just to let you know what we're doing, we have assembled a task force so that we can address Americans with hearing loss who are actively searching for work and we know greatly underemployed. And our goal is to increase employment opportunities for Americans with hearing loss in the labor force. And to do that, we work with companies and we work with individuals, hopefully bringing them together. So next slide, Amanda. We do this because the statistics paint a picture that we all know. We know that people who are hard of hearing are less likely to be employed. And so we have lower employment rates than we'd like. We know that the job search can be a challenge in many cases, when to declare and to disclose that there's a hearing loss and who to support. We know that people who are hard of hearing are more likely to be out of the labor force, and once employed may work at salary levels that are less than their peers. You can read the other points on this slide. They all tell the same story, that we have to do a better job to support individuals with hearing loss in the workforce. So Amanda, do you want to put a slide ahead? So here's our task force. We're made up of people who are spread across the country, come from different backgrounds. Some have hearing loss. Some of us are in academia. Some of us are in the workforce, in leadership positions who do the recruiting and hiring. So we all bring different perspectives. And today, well, first of all, I want to thank them for bringing these webinars together and working together. But I also want to turn it over to Dr. David Baldridge, who will moderate this session today. And again, thank you for all joining us.
So thank you, Kelly. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. And thank you everyone for attending. As Kelly mentioned, I'm a professor at Oregon State University. And it's my pleasure to introduce Theresa Goddard tonight. Teresa has worked for JAN for about 13 years. JAN stands for Job Accommodation Network. She is currently the lead consultant on JAN's sensory team, which serves people with hearing loss, among other sensory disabilities, and she also works with their employers. In this role, Teresa fields questions from employees and employers regarding their rights and responsibilities under the Americans with Disabilities Act, and assists in identifying accommodation solutions for individuals with hearing loss, among other sensory disabilities. Teresa earned her master's degree in speech pathology and a bachelor's degree in speech pathology and audiology from West Virginia University. There's a lot more I could say about Teresa, but I'm going to keep it short so we can maximize our time for a presentation. But please do read her biography. It's fascinating and extremely impressive. So Teresa, I'm going to turn it over to you in a second. I do want to remind audience members you can post questions you'd like answered. We're going to let Teresa present and then save the last 15 minutes just for questions and answers from the audience. And you can always email Jan directly. They're there to serve you. And we'll post their email address to the chat. So Teresa.
Teresa, you are muted.
Oh, thanks. Okay, can everyone see my slides?
Yes, looks great.
Okay, fantastic. So thank you, David and Kelly, for that great introduction. I'm here today from the Job Accommodation Network. Our email address and our phone number are up here on this first screen. Those will be coming back later in the presentation. But please feel free to reach out to the Job Accommodation Network with any questions that you may have about accommodations for hearing and how to get those implemented in the workplace. I'm going to talk with you a little bit today about what the Job Accommodation Network does and give you some examples of the types of accommodations that we're seeing employers implement. Okay, so we'll be talking a bit about Jan. I'll give you an overview of what a reasonable accommodation is and how that requesting process works. We'll talk a little bit about hiring, because one of the most helpful things that you can do for yourself when you're job seeking as a person with a disability is understand things like what's allowed and what's not allowed. What can an employer say to you and ask of you, and what can they not? Because there's a lot of misconceptions about the hiring stage. Then we'll talk about some typical accommodation needs and some assistive technology that can be used to accommodate in the workplace, along with some accommodation examples right before we wrap up and head to the questions. So if you've never heard of the Job Accommodation Network, or JAN as we're more commonly called, we've actually been around for quite a long time. The organization has existed since before the ADA came into being in 1990. We've been around for well over 30 years, doing consultations on workplace accommodations and also giving technical assistance on the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Rehabilitation Act, especially those parts that have to do with employment. Now, will we take a non-employment related question? Yes, we will, and we'll try to answer it if we can. If you happen to call us about something we can't answer for you, we'll try to point you to an appropriate resource. We also have an entrepreneurship team, and what that team does is assist people with disabilities who are hoping to start a small business, or perhaps already have one running, or who might be looking for some type of self-employment opportunity, because we all know how hard it is to break into the traditional workforce as a person with a disability. So some people find it's a little bit easier to start their own business so that they can self-accommodate. All of Jan's consultants are experienced in their specialty areas. So as you heard, I've got a background in speech pathology and audiology, but we have other consultants who are very experienced in the areas where they typically provide consultation. So for example, on our cognitive and neurological team, the team lead is a former special educator who worked for many years with students with cognitive needs. Our service is free. Anyone can contact us and receive consultation completely free of charge. And we also, at this time, are not charging speaking fees if somebody needs to have a presentation, such as I'm doing for you today. Our service is national. We do serve the entire United States, including the territories. So this means I sometimes have to find the right time to call someone in Guam or in Puerto Rico. We try to make our service as easy to use as possible for the public, and most importantly, we're confidential. So earlier you heard that I work with employees and their employers, but I don't typically work with them at the same time unless I'm specifically asked. If an employee calls me and asks for a consultation about their situation, what we say together, that's private information. And I won't confirm or deny that you have ever contacted Jan. I certainly wouldn't reveal to your employer if they were to call. The only way that could happen is with a signed waiver. We keep everything confidential. If your employer calls, that applies to them too. We can't confirm or deny which companies have contacted us because that information is confidential. Then we in general try to meet people where they are in the accommodation process and understand their needs, hoping to provide the exact information that they need to process the next step of getting their accommodation. People can contact us as many times as necessary as they're going through the accommodation process. For employers, we can be helpful in meeting timelines. Employers are asked by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to respond to requests for accommodation in a timely manner. They're supposed to act expeditiously and avoid unnecessary delays. Jan can help employers to do that by helping them find the information that they need in order to implement an accommodation. We're also able to assist with the interactive process, which is the process of employees and employers working together to effect an accommodation, to make an effective accommodation become implemented and continue to be monitored, basically. We also, as I said, provide targeted technical assistance on the Rehabilitation Act and the ADA, specifically Section 501 of the Rehabilitation Act and Title I of the ADA. If you visit our website, you will see a vast array of resources related to the ADA and accommodations for various impairments and conditions, and we do maintain your confidentiality. So at this time, I'd like to talk about this question: what is a request for reasonable accommodation? And the reason I want to bring this up is that sometimes a person will think they have made an accommodation request when in fact they've perhaps stopped short of making a request that the employer is required to follow up on. So for instance, let's say an applicant or an employee just says that they have a condition. Because the person isn't really asking for anything to be changed in the workplace, that's not a full request. When an applicant or an employee indicates the need for an adjustment or change at work for a reason related to a medical impairment or a disability, that's an accommodation request that an employer needs to follow up on. So an accommodation request has two pieces. You have to say that you need something changed in the workplace. That's piece one. And it has to be made clear to the employer that it is for a medical reason. That's step two. You have to have both pieces in order to have a valid accommodation request initiated. Now, it's not required that the employee or applicant use the words ADA or reasonable accommodation when they are making a request. And they're not required to make the request in writing. However, it's a good idea to make that request in writing. An employee is not required to make that request at a particular time. It's okay to wait until you realize that you're going to need an accommodation. And this is something that often comes up for those who are hard of hearing. Often people don't know exactly what they're going to need, or if indeed they will need anything at all, until they've been in the work environment and had a chance to experience it. So for instance, until you begin working in a particular setting, you might not know exactly what equipment you'll be using. You might not know the extent to which you'll need to use the telephone. And you certainly won't know about the background noise that you might have to deal with. Now, a request can be made through a recruiter, a hiring manager, a supervisor, another type of manager, through human resources. In federal settings, it's often made through a disability program manager or any other appropriate professional in the work environment. So typically people will first approach a supervisor or HR. One thing that we often suggest is that you would approach your supervisor and make your written accommodation request in the form of an email where you could CC HR and send it to your supervisor. So what's not a request? Just voluntarily telling your employer that you have a disability is not a request for accommodation. People will often say to me, well, they knew that I had trouble hearing because I mentioned it. Why didn't they do anything? It might be because you never actually asked them to change anything. So disability disclosure without a specific request doesn't have both parts. And also a request for a workplace adjustment or access to a benefit that's available to all employees, including those without disabilities. That's not an accommodation request. That's asking for access to what you're already allowed to have access to. So for instance, during the pandemic times, we've seen many people who found accommodations that really worked well for them when they were teleworking. So for instance, people were able to adjust the volume in Zoom meetings and take advantage of captioning in Zoom meetings and didn't want to give that up by returning to the work environment where they were going to be in person all the time for their meetings and where they would have to contend with masks. I'm sure we all know that masks have been a very big issue for lots of people with disabilities. And it's not only impacting the deaf and hard of hearing community, but it's also impacting, for instance, the community of people with respiratory impairments such as asthma. So some people might want to stay on telework. If you're asking because of an issue related to hearing, that's an accommodation request. But if you just ask for access to a telework program that's available to everybody in your job category, that's not an accommodation request. So when making an accommodation request, you want to be aware of your rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Although it's not required that you make your request in writing, we all at JAN think it's a good idea to document that request by writing an accommodation request letter. You can find samples on the JAN website. And you should also be prepared to offer medical documentation. Usually employers aren't permitted to ask for medical documentation when something is obvious or when you've already provided documentation. But many people who are hard of hearing and don't wear a visible hearing aid don't necessarily present as someone with an obvious disability. So you want to be prepared to offer that medical documentation if it's requested. Be clear and specific, have an idea of what you think would work if possible, and be prepared to explain your needs because the employer might need to understand your needs in order to pick a different accommodation if they can't provide what you're asking for. And also you want to contact a supervisor or HR. So a reasonable accommodation is any change in the work environment or the way things are usually done that results in an equal employment opportunity for an individual with a disability. And we're going to talk about some various examples of accommodation. Where does this come from? This is from the EEOC's Technical Assistance Manual on the ADA. So one thing I want to address is the pre-employment process. Employers are supposed to provide reasonable accommodation that enables an applicant with a known disability to participate in the application process, but you have to ask for the accommodation that you need. The employer is going to be responsible for those costs and arrangements. So for instance, if you're going to have a job interview by Zoom and you need to have that interview captioned, you would want to request either CART, ideally, or automated captioning. I think CART is a little bit more effective. An employer can't refuse to provide an accommodation solely because it entails some costs. But the employer does have some flexibility to choose among those accommodations that might work. And if one is an undue hardship for the employer to provide, if it's too expensive or difficult to provide, they're supposed to provide an alternate option if possible. So for the hiring process, some examples are modifying application policies and procedures, providing materials in accessible format, modifying interview methods. So this is one that comes up a lot for those who are deaf and hard of hearing. Sharing questions in advance is something that you can request. Not all employers will provide it. Providing equipment sometimes does come up if someone needs to do a job demonstration as part of the hiring process and they need an assistive listening device in order to do that effectively. Can an employer ask you to voluntarily disclose your disability status? They can for affirmative action purposes. And in fact, if they are federal contractors, it's likely that they're supposed to. So on the screen, we have an example of what's typically on that type of form. You're supposed to be able to choose between the options, yes, I have a disability, or previously had a disability, no, I don't have a disability, or I don't wish to answer. So what are some typical tasks that require accommodations? Well, interacting with others, receiving information, asking questions during meetings and trainings. Telephone is a big one. Meeting safety standards is one that poses a lot of challenges in manufacturing environments. People who are hard of hearing and wear hearing aids may have some challenges getting the type of hearing protection that they need in order to wear it with their hearing aids. Taking vital signs in healthcare settings is something where an amplified stethoscope or a visual stethoscope may be helpful. And with the transition to remote work and remote meetings, we saw a big increase in requests for captioning and other accommodations. Now we're seeing requests for accommodations as people return to the workplace, but most of us are still masked. So here's a quick example. An intern at a federal agency needed to discuss project details with her team, but face-to-face and telephone communication were both very difficult for her. So as an accommodation, the employer set up a secure instant messaging client so that all team members could discuss projects via chat. And then the intern was able to successfully exchange ideas about team projects with team members who also found the chat logs really useful. Here are some other typical accommodations: improving the signal to noise ratio so that whatever you're needing to hear is louder than the background noise. Allowing alternate means of communication. So for example, for someone who uses an interpreter, allowing use of an interpreter. Allowing text-based communication. Providing assistive listening devices. Some people may use their hearing aids, but others may need an assistive listening device that works with their hearing aids in order to really be effective. Use good conversational and meeting etiquette. So this means in a meeting where there's a microphone, a moderator might repeat or paraphrase questions and comments into the microphone or pass a microphone around. so that everybody's voice can be picked up, and use good lighting and line of sight. There are some pretty decent array microphones as well, but they're still not quite where I would like them to be in terms of technology where a microphone in the middle of the table is going to pick up a whole conference table. Provide equipment for telephone access. Sometimes the audiologist may recommend very specific equipment to connect your hearing aids to a telephone. Providing alerting devices so that you know when the fire alarm is going off or when the doorbell is ringing. And reviewing emergency evacuation plans to make sure that all employees are going to be safe. Here's a great example. 2 employees worked in close proximity to each other, so they were kind of close together, but they weren't in line of sight. There was a big piece of equipment right between them. But they needed to communicate in order to time their actions while they operated that big honking piece of equipment that was blocking their view of each other. So usually in that setting, workers would call out to each other, but one employee couldn't hear well enough for this to work. Oh, and for added fun, every time somebody made a mistake using this equipment, it cost the company about $3,000. So the consultant responding to the call gave a lot of information on devices for typing back and forth. Usually we would give information on captioning devices too, but we ruled that out in this case because of all the background noise. And the background noise was a factor in the decision not to offer an assistive listening device too, because it was going to be hard to come up with one that would amplify voices enough without getting too much of the background noise. So the employer decided to try a device called the UB Duo 2, which is pictured on this slide. They're on UB Duo 3 now. This is kind of an evolving product. And it operates using proprietary wireless signals designed for typing back and forth. What I type appears on your screen and vice versa. It's pretty fast, and it doesn't rely on wireless internet. We also talked about some mounting systems. Another common need is telephone accommodations. So that could include adapters for hearing aids. It could include telephone amplification. A lot of people are using captioning services such as CapTel. And there are models now that work with Cisco phone systems pretty well. Many people use other types of relay services and equipment. I don't see so many amplified phones anymore. A lot of people with hearing aids would use their hearing aids for amplification, but you have to have the right equipment to connect. One of the most important pieces of information you can provide your employer with is if you know what you need to connect your hearing aids to, a landline office type phone, tell them. If you're not sure, it's helpful for the employer to know the brand and model of your hearing aid so that they can attempt to reach out to a hearing aid company that can help them figure that piece out. But hopefully your audiologist will share information with you about exactly what's going to suit your needs. And alternate methods like email are still something that we commonly see. So here's an example. A supervisor in a manufacturing facility had to be available to respond to phone calls about emergencies at the plant. He was hard of hearing, used hearing aids, but he took them out at night. When he did that, he couldn't hear the phone. Even if he noticed the phone ringing, he couldn't get his hearing aids in place in time to respond effectively. So the employer purchased for him a telephone amplifier, which could be used without hearing aids. Pictured, we have the speech adjust-a-tone, which has 6 little sliders that you can adjust up and down as you need to provide just more than a flat level of amplification. And also, they got him a lamp flasher and a bed shaker so that he was going to be able to wake up and notice the phone, even if he was asleep with his hearing aids out. Now, are there other amplifiers? Sure, there are lots of different ones. And this is a concern that I see a lot also from folks who are hard of hearing and own their own business. They might be really concerned about getting their hearing aids in time to answer an important business phone call. And here we just have a little bit more on situational awareness. People might need to be aware of various sounds in their work environment. On the JAN website, you'll find examples of lots of different types of equipment and vendors for that equipment. that can help people become aware of a sound that's happening in their environment. Some other typical accommodations are modified policies, training modifications, just looking for a different way to communicate something, and job restructuring, which is where maybe you do part of the job in a different way, or if it's a small part of the job, that might be able to be reallocated to someone else. Here's an example. An employee wanted to text with coworkers and her supervisor, but mobile phones weren't allowed in the part of the facility where she worked. She had asked for a modification to the policy, but her employer wanted other options to consider. So they contacted Jan. The Jan consultant responding to the call gave information on a variety of communication access devices for automatically captioning conversations, including apps, low-tech things like whiteboards, and automated captioning software. So Interpretype would be an example of that. With telework and social distancing, we've certainly seen a lot of challenges, particularly around masks. And at first, it was also really hard to deliver effective accommodations in the virtual environment for meetings. We kind of had to get used to that. So here's an example of a phone call that I handled where an employee had moved home because of the pandemic and was having some trouble adapting her accommodation. She usually used a TTY device for telephone communication. Not too many people use those anymore, but we still get a couple of calls a year. Her employer had temporarily restructured her job, saying that she wouldn't have to make or receive phone calls while she was at home. But then social distancing went on and on and on, and she was still at home. The employer wasn't able to continue excusing her from phone calls because we just didn't know how long this thing was going to last. So she had a personal TTY at home, but it was designed for use with her landline home phone. Well, her landline home phone that she used to have, because she wasn't currently maintaining a landline at home due to the cost. I understand that. I got rid of mine too. So we talked with her about what type of phone equipment she had on hand. She had an iPhone. It had some internal TTY software. It was compatible with some external TTYs. So we directed her to information on how to use those TTY functions and how to set up a test call so that she could hopefully start making and receiving calls for work. So here's just a page with some examples of the types of things you're going to find on the Jan website. If you go to askjan.org, in our A to Z section, you'll find the following topics: disability disclosure, how to decide when to tell your employer, the interactive process, medical exams and inquiries, online applications, sample forms, so you can get an idea of what these forms are supposed to look like in case your employer gives you a medical inquiry form, and testing accommodations. We also have some articles on the interviewing process. Some additional resources that might be helpful to you are these resources for the pre-employment process and job applicants. Opening doors to all candidates, tips for ensuring access for applicants with disabilities. That's an ODEP publication. If you didn't know, the Job Accommodation Network is funded by the Office of Disability Employment Policy at the Department of Labor. And here are some of the things that I hoped we would get covered today. So David, if you can join us and talk a little bit about these questions, other questions that may have come up.
All right, thank you so much, Teresa. Rumor has it I'm a little bit echoey, so if there's too much echo, I may have you read the questions yourself also.
Sure.
Okay, so to start with, I think you did a great job of explaining what Jan is, and I'll just emphasize, for me, I go to Jan's website quite frequently. I love that you have a separate section for people who are hard of hearing and rely on sound, and then a whole separate write-up for people who rely on sign language because the accommodation needs can just be so different. But I really encourage people to go to the website. There's such great resources there. And you covered this, I think, but it might be nice to focus a little bit on people who are currently looking for work. How can they use Jan in their job search?
Great question, David. Unfortunately, Jan doesn't do any job placement, but we do have a section on our website with resources for job applicants. And one of the best things that we have on there, in my opinion, is a little article that we have on disclosure in the interviewing process and how to decide if you want to bring up your disability during an interview or if you would prefer to wait. So technically, you don't have to request an accommodation until you know it will be needed. And so many people who are hard of hearing self-accommodate with their hearing aids or with strategies and tactics that they've learned over the years. Many people don't request a formal accommodation unless it's absolutely necessary. It's okay to wait and see. But if you know you're going to need something for the interview process, that's when you really, really need to speak up during that hiring process. But if people are just unsure of where to find those resources, or if they're looking for something specific and they're not sure if we have it or not, they can absolutely just pick up the phone or use the live help, live chat function on our website. It's a little tab on the front page that I think you can find pretty easily. And you can chat with somebody by text if you prefer not to use the phone. That's totally okay. We also have a way for you to submit questions through our website. And you can ask us anything related to hearing and employment or the ADA. If you're not sure if it's something we can answer, I would say just go ahead and ask. Somebody can get in touch with you and offer whatever we're able to. But I would say the resources for job applicants on the askjan.org page is a great place to start. And while we don't do job placement, we do have links to places that do offer more supports of that kind. I would say check out that section if you're at all curious about how to apply for a job as a person with a disability and what resources are available to you. And if you're not seeing what you're looking for, just get in touch.
Okay, super. So it sounds like a good place to start is with the website, review the material, and folks here can contact Jan directly with questions.
Absolutely.
Is it also common for people to ask HR or their supervisor to contact Jan to learn more themselves?
Sometimes people will. I don't know how often those requests are followed up on by HR professionals, although occasionally we will get a request to do a conference call or perhaps a Zoom meeting that includes a supervisor, an HR person, and an individual with a hearing loss, so that we can all be kind of together. And in that case, Jan serves as an informational resource. We're there to answer questions about the ADA and to offer ideas for how an accommodation could work. What we can't do is act as an advocate. That's not our role. But there's a lot that we can do to help just by being present and looking for opportunities to share information that could be helpful.
Okay, super, thank you. So we have quite a few questions rolling into the Q&A. So I'll have you open it too so you can see them directly. Okay. But we'll just start with the first one. Interesting and very technical. So is it okay for an employer to disallow the use of Bluetooth for an employee who wants to use it to be able to work with the phone system? The reason they are disallowing it is security. Credit card information would be exchanged over the phone, and the employer is saying that Bluetooth is discoverable, so that's an issue.
I'm glad that someone asked about that. That actually does come up a lot. And it is more likely, I would say, to come up in a federal setting based on the calls that we get from Jan. Unfortunately, employers can have policies that limit the use of certain types of technology, including Bluetooth, if they apply them across the board and if they are kind of consistent with business necessity It can sometimes be an undue hardship to modify them. Anytime an employer has a policy, it's okay to ask for a modification to the policy. But there are times when an employer can show that modifying the policy to allow you to bring something in would pose an undue hardship to them as an employer. I've even seen people denied the ability to use Bluetooth-enabled monitors for diabetes, things to monitor their blood glucose in some very secure settings. Now, what does happen sometimes is if an employer can't allow somebody to use, say, their Bluetooth-enabled hearing aids in a certain building while working in a certain role, some employers will try to move you to a different part of their campus or into a role where Bluetooth can be permitted. So that can happen. Great question, though. Some employers will allow telecoil because it's very short range, but won't allow Bluetooth. That happens too.
Okay, thank you, Teresa. That's fascinating. The next question is interesting also. So if an accommodation request is granted as reasonable, can it ever be deemed unreasonable later on? And if so, under what kinds of circumstances?
Yes, accommodations can change. The EEOC made this clear in a letter that somebody actually originally wrote about parking. They had a parking related accommodation that the employer was changing. And so a letter was written to the EEOC to ask if this is okay. And this is the letter in which the EEOC has put in writing that accommodations don't necessarily last forever. The EEOC states that there are several reasons why an accommodation could be changed or withdrawn, but in the letter, they only list two. The first would be that the accommodation is no longer needed. If an accommodation is no longer needed, it can be withdrawn. The second relates to undue hardship, when an accommodation becomes too difficult or too expensive for an employer to provide. So undue hardship in its short definition means significant difficulty or expense. When something is posing significant difficulty or expense to the point that the employer is unable to provide it, they can withdraw that accommodation, but they should work with you to try to find a different accommodation. So yeah, accommodations unfortunately can change. But it can't just be out of the clear blue sky. There should be some kind of reason.
So I would say, Teresa, that answer helps explain why Jan is so important, because it gets very complicated with those two questions. The next one I think is just kind of reviewing what we talked about before, but the question is, will Jan do a consultation with both the employee and the employer together to negotiate accommodations?
We can do that on request, but we can only do it as long as everyone who's participating in the conversation is okay with a Jan representative being present. Also, only the more senior consultants at Jan are permitted to do that. So our junior level consultants and employment specialists don't serve in that role. We have a limited number of people who can do it because we have to be so careful not to take sides and not to cross the line into offering legal advice or making what are called determinations. But is it possible? Yes, it does happen. And it's something that we do only on request and when both sides are okay with it.
All right. The next question is about the live chat that's on your website. So the question specifically is on the hours that it's manned, when it's available.
So the live chat is available during our regular business hours, which are 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. Eastern Time, Monday to Friday.
Okay, super. The next question, if I ask for an accommodation from my current employer and they turn it down, at what point does it make sense to go to a lawyer and press the issue?
Before going to a lawyer, most people will contact the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to inquire about starting the complaint process. And an attorney is not necessary for that process. But to be honest, there are people who go to an attorney sooner. Some people will choose to contact an attorney to see if the attorney can write a letter to their employer explaining the accommodation need and that it's something that the employer should be considering under the ADA. And that can be a very powerful strategy if you have the means to do it. But a lot of people will try to negotiate with the employer first. And in fact, the EEOC generally likes to see that someone has done everything that they can to try to work with the employer first before filing a complaint. So I would say keep records. That's why we suggest writing an accommodation request letter and keeping a copy. But you should keep copies or notes on any conversations that you have with the employer. And you can also contact Jan to kind of get a feel for if there's anything else you can do before you start that process.
Okay, super. The next question is a little more technical, but what is the best way to pass around a microphone when tables are set up classroom style?
Well, it kind of depends on the classroom style that we're talking about, to be honest with you. In some elementary classrooms, of course, desks are clustered, and sometimes you can get away with one microphone or perhaps a small array microphone for each cluster of desks. In the pandemic, we're not seeing a lot of passing microphones around. When we are seeing it, people are using something like gloves. Maybe every student gets a glove, and then we all take our gloves off when we're done with the microphone. Not sure how effective that is from an infection control standpoint, but it's something people are trying. One really interesting innovation that I'm seeing, though, especially in elementary classrooms, is usually all of the students will have a tablet or perhaps a Chromebook that they've been issued by the school. And usually we use those for at-home learning. And maybe during the pandemic early on, people might get onto remote meetings with their teachers. I think a lot of us have experienced that this past 2 years. The teachers will open a meeting in the classroom with the students physically present so that each student's device can pick up their individual voice and then use automated captioning within the meeting to capture what each person is saying. So I've seen this as a really innovative approach, and it was actually developed by a teacher who contacted Jan.
That's great. I'll just, add in, I think external microphones are really kind of the brave new frontier for people who are hard of hearing, and which microphones are effective varies a lot person to person and based on the hearing aid or cochlear implants that they're using. So I encourage people to experiment with microphones, but it will take a little trial and error to find what works for you.
Absolutely.
So the next question has to do with using Zoom. So I'll just read it. From what I understand, in most cases, a potential employer is not allowed to ask if you have a disability. Yet in so many cases, when we have Zoom interviews, we have to ask them to activate their captions. We all know that this is both implicit and explicit bias and discrimination that takes place in the interview process. By having to ask, we are basically giving information that is not legal to be asked of us. Do you have thoughts on this?
Well, my first thought is that I wish all employers would just defaultly turn on the captioning because that would make it more of a universal design, right? That would be better for everyone. And I know for myself, captions are helpful to me, even though I'm a person with normal hearing. They help me to stay focused. And if I miss a word, it's just really easy for me to double check things. So I appreciate captions all the time. Technically, though, if employers don't usually have captions, asking to have them turned on is an accommodation request because we're asking for a change within the interview environment, asking the employer to remove the communication barrier that is solved by providing captions. So technically that's an accommodation request, and it is usually necessary to disclose your disability to get an accommodation. But we could all prevent this problem if everybody would just turn on the dang captions because they're so helpful. So that's my personal take on it. Back to the microphone, if I can really quickly, another approach we've seen is to set up a microphone station. So for instance, there might be a desk or a podium within the classroom where students can approach to make a question or comment kind of one by one. I think that works better in some settings than others. Probably not going to work in a pre-K, but maybe third graders can handle it.
All right, thank you. I was going to say, just a follow-up, I really encourage everyone in the audience to request captioning whenever they can, right? Because the more we request captioning or ask people to turn on captioning, the more it just becomes normal. The next question, though, how do you handle employers who claim that virtual work is not an accommodation because the person was able to work in person, then in brackets, with tremendous effort and barriers prior to the pandemic?
Well, I would say that based on the ADA, we know that job restructuring is an accommodation that's specifically recognized by the EEOC. They write about it in a document called Reasonable Accommodation and Undue Hardship under the ADA. This is kind of the first place it's mentioned, except for the Technical Assistance Manual. And part of job restructuring is being allowed to do the job in a different way or from a different location. And from that seed grew everything that we know about EEOC guidance and case law on telework being an accommodation. So if people say it's not an accommodation, I can't really agree with that at all, because we know from the EEOC's own words that telework is an accommodation. And there are many, many cases where a person might be able to be more efficient and productive if given the right tools. So just because you could kind of do things before without this tool of telework and virtual work, or you could do it, but you really had to give 120% every day and it was wearing you out, it doesn't mean that it wouldn't be a win-win to let you continue to have that now. I think it's helpful if we see the ADA as a way to request the tools that we need to be the most efficient, productive employees that we can be. That's something that employers really respond to more than kind of the stick approach of this is the ADA and you have to do it. If you can frame it as a win-win, I think you're just going to have a better conversation overall.
I'll just chime in there. So I am only teaching via Zoom right now, and I just convinced my university that that was in the best interest of my students. So like many people here, I speech read, and putting me in a classroom with 40 mass students, many of whom English is a second language, just was not in their best interest. So as Teresa said, I frame it first as just how best to serve my students. And of course, if necessary down the road, then it would be a more formal accommodation request. Another interesting question. So is there any deadline in terms of time frame for an employer to meet an accommodation request? I'm assuming after a request is made.
Great question, Teresa. I'm so glad that you asked that. It depends on whether you're in a federal setting or a private setting, and this is why. The federal settings are governed by the Rehabilitation Act, specifically 501. And part of their process is to have an EEO office that responds to complaints They also have reasonable accommodation procedures that are more robust than we usually see in the private sector. And usually there's a timeline built into those reasonable accommodation guidelines if you're in the federal sector. This also is sometimes true in other government sectors like state and local governments. Not always, but sometimes. However, if you're not in a federal setting, let's say you're under a private employer, a state employer, or a city government, technically you're under Title I of the ADA. That requires employers to act expeditiously and avoid unnecessary delays. So you can find that language in the document Reasonable Accommodation and Undue Hardship under the ADA. It doesn't tell us exactly what that means. It just gives us those descriptions. But there are a couple of examples that can help you work it out. So for instance, let's say somebody needs a piece of equipment. The equipment is back ordered and the employer can't get it, but they're making every effort. Usually that employer won't be penalized because they're making every effort to get it as soon as possible. On the other hand, if your request just goes and sits on somebody's desk for 3 weeks and nothing happens, that's an unnecessary delay, the type that an employer should avoid. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. So the next question is from a faculty member who teaches clinical audiologists. And the question is this: do you have resources available that their students can provide to future clients?
I would say the A to Z section of the JAN website is a great place to start. We do have a section on accommodations that are hearing related, but you can also contact JAN to see about doing a presentation for your students or do a mock call. A lot of times professors will make an assignment for their students that they should contact JAN and get accommodation ideas for a particular scenario. And then we get these fake phone calls that aren't actually about a real person. It'd be great if you give us a heads up that that's coming, but you don't have to. But sometimes too, they might assign scenarios and try to arrange a time for a JAN consultant to do a Zoom with the class or a conference call with the class. That's something we do a lot.
Okay, so different but really interesting questions. So first of all, noting that so much networking and team building takes place out of the office and informal gatherings like restaurants and golf courses. Even though accommodations are in place in the office, they are not readily available in these different social settings outside the workplace. So it's very difficult for the employee who needs hearing assisting technology in these social settings. What do you suggest for navigating those situations outside of the workplace?
I'd say talk to your audiologist to see if there are portable options that could work for you and request them. To be honest, that's where I would begin. What's the worst they can say? No, but we do we do know that for things like holiday parties, if you're deaf and use ASL, you can request an interpreter for an employer-sponsored party, like a retirement party or an office holiday party. So there is kind of a legal argument that you can ask for accommodations for employer-sponsored work events. So I would say ask.
Okay, that's great. You know, I'm noticing the time, we're down to the last 2 minutes and we made it through, I think, like 16 out of 18 questions. But I just want to remind people in the audience that these are all really great questions, and I encourage you to ask them directly of Jan using email or live chat or calling in if you prefer, because we're not going to get to all the questions tonight.
Yeah, please feel free to send an email to jan@askjan.org. And if anybody at HLA would like to gather a list of these questions we didn't get to, I'd be happy to respond. Oh, I see one about a hearing dog. That's a great one. We get a few questions about hearing dogs.
So Amanda, I think we're down to the final minute.
Yeah, I just put the Jan at askjan.org in the chat if anyone wants to grab it. Teresa said you could reach out directly and any questions you have. Oh, and here's the information up as well. Jan seems like it has a ton of resources online as well. But I just want to thank you so much to our employment task force members, Kelly and David, and to our presenter, Teresa. It was a great presentation today. I also want to thank Lisa Johnson, our court reporter, for her amazing captioning services today. This webinar will also be posted on the HLAA website at hearingloss.org. Please check hearingloss.org for future webinars and webinar recordings. So thank you again for joining us tonight, and I hope you have a great rest of your week. Thank you, everyone.